A record deal starts with a handshake and ends, more often than anybody in the industry wants to admit, with a betrayal. Sometimes that betrayal is quiet, a lawsuit filed after years of silence, a check that never shows up. Sometimes it's loud, a diss track built specifically to humiliate a mentor by name, in public, forever. And in one case on this list, it involved a gun, a hostage situation, and a signature forced out of a label owner in his own recording booth. Every artist here got exactly what a record deal promises: money, a machine, a shot at forever. But for one reason or another, they turned around and came for the hand that ripped them off. In January 2026, a rapper Gucci Mane signed, developed, and helped build into a star, allegedly held him at gunpoint and forced him to sign away everything on camera. Pooh Shiesty signed to Gucci Mane's 1017 Records in 2020. Not long after his 2019 single Hell Night started building buzz out of Memphis, the partnership paid off fast. Shiesty became a standout on the label's So Icy Summer compilation, then broke out fully with his 2021 mixtape Shiesty Season, even as he cycled in and out of legal trouble that eventually landed him a federal prison sentence on a firearms conviction. Gucci Mane, meanwhile, was released from his own custody in October 2025 after serving 3 years. And by early 2026, reports were circulating that Shiesty was being courted by Yo Gotti's CMG Records, raising the question of whether 1017 would actually let him go. According to federal prosecutors, that question got answered at gunpoint. On January 10th, 2026, Shiesty and Memphis rapper Big 30 arranged what they described as a business meeting at a recording studio in Dallas to discuss his contract. Once Gucci Mane and 2 other men were inside, prosecutors allege Shiesty and 8 co-defendants executed a coordinated armed takeover of the studio. The indictment claims Shiesty produced an AK-style pistol and forced Gucci Mane to sign paperwork to releasing him from his 1017 deal on the spot. Then had Big 30 film Gucci, verbally confirming on camera that Pooh Shiesty was dropped from the label. From there, prosecutors say the group robbed the 3 victims of roughly $450,000 in jewelry and cash, including Gucci Mane's own wedding band, and that one victim was choked to near unconsciousness during the confrontation. Gucci Mane addressed what happened himself months later on a track called Crash Dummy, rapping about walking into a room, feeling the pressure building, and realizing too late that the people around him were plotting against him. Shiesty and his 8 co-defendants, including his own father, were indicted on federal kidnapping and robbery charges, and the case is still working through federal court in Dallas as of this writing, with prosecutors calling the evidence against him extraordinarily strong and opposing his release from custody. If convicted, Pooh Shiesty faces a possible sentence of life in prison. Every other case on this list stayed inside a courtroom or a recording booth. From here, the story rewinds 2.5 decades, back to when turning on a label just meant walking out the door over a bad check. Juvenile's voice was Cash Money Records before it belonged to anybody else on the roster, and that didn't stop him from taking the label to court twice. By the late 1990s, Juvenile was the label's biggest name. He signed with Cash Money after CEO Brian Baby Williams found him at a bus stop and heard him freestyle, and the bet paid off in a way nobody could have predicted. His 1998 album, 400 Degrees, went quadruple platinum and cracked the Billboard Top 10, built on the strength of Ha and Back That Adds Up, the song that basically wrote the blueprint for Southern rap crossing into the mainstream. As a member of the Hot Boys alongside Lil Wayne, BG, and Turk, he was one of the 4 faces of a label about to take over the entire genre. Then, the money stopped adding up. By 2002, both Juvenile and fellow Hot Boy BG had left Cash Money, publicly claiming financial mismanagement. This wasn't a quiet exit. Juvenile fought the label for years over what he was actually owed, and by his own account, he won. He later described taking Cash Money to court and prevailing after a 3-year legal fight, one that left him bitter enough to turn down calls from label mates who'd stayed loyal through it. Once he'd proven the label had been shorting him, the same artists who told other people what he'd said started reaching back out, wanting to know how he did it. He didn't stay gone forever. In April 2003, Juvenile returned to Cash Money for a reported $4 million deal, an arrangement that produced Juve the Great and its #1 single, Slow Motion. But the piece didn't hold long term either. He left again, bounced to Atlantic Records, and when asked years later why he kept walking away from the label that made him a star, his answer was blunt. "My reason to leave Cash Money is the same reason most artists leave their label, money," he said. He wasn't alone in that complaint. Cash Money's own in-house producer Manny Fresh, the man behind nearly every beat on those early Hot Boys records, walked for the same reason, telling anyone who'd listen he left over unpaid scratch and moolah. Juvenile eventually settled back in with Cash Money for good in 2014, but the pattern he set, star artists publicly accusing the label of shorting him, then walking, then sometimes coming back, became something close to a Cash Money tradition. A public accounting dispute is one thing, The next case turned that same grievance into a full public campaign against the label that signed them, t-shirts and all. Getting dropped from a label is usually the bad outcome. The Locs spent years fighting just to make it happen. The Yonkers trio signed with Sean Diddy Combs' Bad Boy Records in the mid-1990s, and their 1998 debut album, Money, Power, and Respect, went platinum, powered by the tribute single, We'll Always Love Big Papa. On paper, it was a success story. In practice, the Locs felt trapped inside an image that didn't fit them. Bad Boy had built its identity on radio, friendly, high-budget, shiny suit era hits, while the Locs were establishing themselves as some of the hardest, most street-rooted lyricists in New York. We just needed to be with a rougher label, remember Sheek Louch later said, a harder label that fit our image. They tried the quiet route first. Lawyers, conference calls, formal requests to be released from their contract. None of it worked, so the group escalated and they did it in public. They started wearing Let the Locs Go t-shirts at New York rap shows, turning their own contract dispute into a grassroots campaign fans could see and repeat. Dubbed Free the Locs, it became one of the most visible artist versus label standoffs of its era, a group essentially organizing its own fan base to pressure a label into letting them leave. The tension didn't stay peaceful behind closed doors either. During a heated 2005 appearance on New York's Hot 97, arguments between the group and Diddy got physical enough that Styles P reportedly threw a chair in the studio, and the group publicly called their former label boss a coward and a thief on air. Diddy eventually let the Locs go to Rough Riders, where they released their harder-edged sophomore album, We Are the Streets, in 2000. But letting them leave didn't mean letting go of everything. Diddy retained ownership of a chunk of the group's publishing for years afterward, a dispute that dragged on in interviews and on-air arguments long after the group had physically left the label. It took nearly 2 decades of on and off negotiation before Diddy and the Locs finally worked out an agreement to return that publishing. A t-shirt campaign and a thrown chair sound almost quaint compared to what came next. The next case turned a label falling out into one of the longest-running diss campaigns in rap history. Dr. Dre and 50 Cent built The Game up to be G-Unit's newest soldier. He spent the next decade tearing the crew down instead. The Game signed to Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment in 2003, and Dre and Interscope head Jimmy Iovine made a calculated decision to place him inside 50 Cent's G-Unit as well, marketing him as a loyal soldier in 50's camp while he prepped his debut. It worked commercially in a big way. The documentary, released in 2005 with heavy input from both 50 Cent and Dr. Dre, launched The Game into stardom behind the hit singles How We Do and Hate It or Love It. The latter only kept off the top of the Hot 100 by 50 Cent's own single. For a moment, the mentor-protege pairing looked like exactly the kind of hit machine a label dreams of building. It fell apart almost as fast as it came together. By early 2005, tensions between Game and 50 Cent had escalated into a full-scale feud, and 50 Cent went public, announcing that Game had been kicked out of G-Unit and claiming Game hadn't given him proper writing credit on 6 songs from the documentary. The two held a press conference weeks later to announce a truce, but the peace didn't hold. Game relaunched hostilities that summer with a boycott campaign against his old crew he called G-Unit, debuting it during a performance at Summer Jam and following it with a mixtape aimed squarely at his former label. The centerpiece was 300 Bars and Runnin', a 15-minute beat-switching marathon aimed directly at G-Unit, and it set off years of retaliation on both sides. 50 Cent responded with the Piggy Bank music video, portraying Game as a Mr. Potato Head doll alongside his other rivals. Game kept firing back across multiple mixtapes explicitly built to tear down his former crew, at one point saying in an interview that Iovine had warned both of them not to blow up the partnership, comparing it to breaking up the Beatles. Game left Aftermath entirely over the dispute, getting shifted to Interscope's Geffen imprint just to get out from under his G-Unit obligations, and he built a second, defining chapter of his career almost entirely out of surviving the split from the label that made him. It took over a decade, and a public reconciliation at a Los Angeles club in 2016 before Game and 50 Cent finally called the feud over for good. Game turned his exit into a whole persona. The next case took that same kind of falling out straight to a record, aimed directly at the man who signed him. Jay-Z signed him, mentored him, and put him on some of his biggest records. Beanie Sigel dissed him on a track anyway. Sigel signed to Roc-A-Fella Records in the late 1990s and quickly became the label's resident street poet, the gritty counterweight to Jay-Z's polish. His 2000 debut album The Truth peaked at number 5 on the Billboard 200, and he followed it with The Reason and The Bee, Coming, both landing in the Billboard Top 5. He led State Property, a whole crew of Philadelphia rappers operating under the Roc-A-Fella banner, and appeared on some of Jay-Z's own biggest records. For a stretch, Sigel wasn't just signed to The Roc. He was one of its most important voices. The relationship fractured slowly through a mix of business friction and Sigel's own legal troubles. He since claimed that Jay-Z's team scheduled his own album releases to directly compete with his, undercutting his sales inside the same label. "Every single album that I dropped, Jay dropped right on top of me," Sigel said, framing it as in-house competition that made it nearly impossible for him to breathe commercially. Around the same period, Jay-Z became president of Def Jam, which prompted Roc-A-Fella co-founders Damon Dash and Kareem Biggs Burke to split off and form their own venture. Sigel, in the middle of his own legal battles, publicly questioned his loyalty to the label, at one point saying he felt closer to Dash and Biggs than to Jay-Z himself, since he never spent real time with Jay outside of business. He later walked that back, saying he didn't want to be dragged into the Dash and Jay-Z split and re-signed with Roc-A-Fella instead. The real breaking point came years later, after Sigel had left the label for good. In 2009, after signing with 50 Cent's G-Unit Records, Sigel recorded I Go Off, a track that directly dissed his former mentor Jay-Z. It was a genuine shot at the man who discovered him, put him on Roc-A-Fella's biggest records, and by Sigel's own account, helped change his life. The two didn't fully bury it for years. Sigel and Jay-Z eventually reunited and performed together at the Tidal B-Sides concert in 2015, officially ending the feud. But the fact that it took a diss record on a rival label's compilation and 6 more years after that to get there says everything about how deep the resentment actually ran. Sigel has kept revisiting it since. As recently as last year, he was still giving interviews, accusing Jay-Z of using their old in-house competition to keep him down, claims some fans have pushed back on by pointing out the actual release gaps between their albums don't fully support the story. Whatever the full truth is, it's clear Sigel walked away from Roc-A-Fella feeling like the label he helped build treated him as an afterthought. Sigel's feud stayed mostly in interviews and one pointed diss track. The next case took that same instinct and turned it into one of the most vicious label callouts hip-hop has ever heard. Roc-A-Fella made Cam'ron a vice president. He answered his collapse with a nearly 8-minute diss track naming names. Cam'ron signed to Roc-A-Fella in the early 2000s and at his peak held real power inside the company, briefly serving as a vice president while his crew, the Diplomats, became one of the most commercially dominant movements in New York rap. Oh Boy and Hey Ma turned Dipset into a fashion and culture moment as much as a musical one. And for a stretch, Cam's affiliation with Roc-A-Fella was treated as a crown jewel of the label's roster. That relationship soured as the label itself fractured. When Jay-Z became president of Def Jam and Roc-A-Fella co-founder Damon Dash exited the company, Cam'ron sided publicly and loudly with Dash, framing Jay-Z as having pushed his own former partner out of the label they'd built together. By his account, the fallout got petty fast. The Diplomats were left off the label's own anniversary tour, and a planned Jay-Z guest verse on one of Cam's singles reportedly got scrapped over bad blood neither side wanted to paper over anymore. In 2006, Cam'ron let all of it out on wax. He released a full-length diss track dedicated to Jay-Z, accusing him by name of taking Roc-A-Fella, Kanye West, and the Roc-A-Wear clothing line away from Damon Dash, and going after Jay-Z personally over his age, his fashion choices, and his handling of Dipset's exit from the label. The label's response wasn't musical. According to Cam'ron, Roc-A-Fella fined him directly for publicly dissing the company he used to help run, on top of formally cutting Dipset loose from the roster. Jay-Z mostly avoided naming Cam'ron directly in response, answering instead with a handful of subliminal lines on his own record rather than a full comeback track. The two never fully reconciled the way Beanie Sigel and Jay-Z eventually did. Cam'ron has maintained in interviews since that the fallout cost him bigger opportunities within the industry, even as he's built a successful business career outside of music. Cam'ron didn't just diss his former label, he named the exact grievances in order on a track built to make sure nobody missed the point. The next case didn't need a diss track at all. The label itself had built its whole reputation on fear, and one of its own co-founders decided that fear wasn't worth the money. Dre co-founded Death Row Records, owned half of it, and walked away from all of it without taking a settlement. At a moment when the company was making more money than almost anyone else in the genre. Dre helped start Death Row Records in 1991 alongside Suge Knight, the DOC, and Dick Griffey, and the label became one of the most dominant forces in music history almost overnight. The Chronic, Dre's own 1992 debut, and Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style the following year, both went multi-platinum and effectively invented the West Coast sound that would define hip-hop for the rest of the decade. At its commercial peak, Death Row was pulling in over $100 million a year, and Dre was a 50% owner of the entire operation. The problem wasn't the money coming in, it was the environment Suge Knight had built around it. Death Row's reputation for intimidation wasn't just industry gossip, it was central to how the label operated. And Dre grew increasingly uneasy with Knight's escalating use of violence and threats to handle business. Other early Death Row artists, including RBX and the DOC, had already left the label disillusioned with its direction, and Knight responded by tightening his grip on whoever remained. Dre kept working, contributing production to Tupac's All Eyes on Me, even as his day-to-day involvement with the label kept shrinking. In March 1996, Dre made the call. He officially left Death Row Records to start his own label, Aftermath Entertainment, in partnership with Interscope. What made the exit remarkable wasn't just that he left the label at its commercial peak, it's what he left behind to do it. Dre walked away from his 50% ownership stake and the master recordings to some of the best-selling rap albums ever made, without a settlement or a payout on his way out the door. "You can't put a price on a peaceful state of mind," he said of the decision at the time. Tupac, who just signed to the label months earlier, reportedly took Dre's exit personally, viewing it as an abandonment right as he was arriving. Leaving didn't end the relationship with the label he'd helped build. Even after Death Row's collapse into bankruptcy and Suge Knight's own long fall into repeated legal trouble, Dre kept pursuing what he believed he was still owed. In 2011, more than 15 years after walking out the door, Dre sued Death Row's successor company over unpaid digital royalties from The Chronic, arguing that the label had never been authorized to profit from digital sales of his own catalog. He won, and the court confirmed he was entitled to millions in unpaid income. It took a decade and a half, but the artist who once walked away from an empire without asking for a dime eventually collected exactly what he was owed. Dre's split proved leaving quietly could still end in a courtroom years later. The last case on this list didn't stop at a song or even a lawsuit years after the fact. It went straight to federal court with a 9-figure number attached from the very start. Lil Wayne called Brian "Birdman" Williams his father for over 2 decades. Then he sued him for $51 million. He was 9 years old when he met the Cash Money boss, who became, by Wayne's own description for years, a surrogate father. That relationship produced some of the best-selling rap albums of the 2000s and helped build an empire. And it still ended with Wayne suing the man who raised him. The cracks started showing publicly in December 2014 over the endlessly delayed Thought Carter 5. Wayne took to Twitter, writing that he wanted off the label and that Cash Money was the reason his album hadn't been released. "I am a prisoner, and so is my creativity," he wrote. "I want off this label and nothing to do with these people, but unfortunately, it ain't that easy." This wasn't a rapper airing minor frustration. This was hip-hop's most commercially dominant artist of the previous decade publicly telling the world he felt trapped by the family that made him. 6 weeks later, the frustration became a federal case. Wayne filed a lawsuit against Birdman and Cash Money for $51 million, accusing the label of violating his contract by withholding money owed to him and delaying Thought Carter 5. The suit sought to void his deal with the label entirely and asked to take his entire Young Money roster with him, including Drake and Nicki Minaj, 2 of the biggest artists in music at the time. It's hard to overstate how severe that ask was. Wayne wasn't just asking for his own freedom, he was trying to gut Cash Money of his future. The fight dragged on for years, and it got personal on both sides. At one point, reports surfaced that lawyers for both sides were close to a settlement, only for Birdman to allegedly call the whole thing off after hearing Wayne shout out Roc-A-Fella instead of Cash Money during a live performance. Wayne, for his part, kept taking public shots too, including a freestyle line aimed squarely at his former mentor. It took roughly 3.5 years of litigation before it finally resolved. In mid-2018, Wayne walked away with a settlement reported to be well over $10 million, funded by Universal Music rather than Birdman himself, finally freeing Thought Carter 5 for release after 4 years of delays. The album dropped that September and debuted at #1, closing out a legal war that started with a man Wayne once called his father and ended with that same man being ordered by a judge to account for exactly how a $100 million advance had been spent. Every case here started the exact same way, with real talent and real trust, and every single one ended with that trust getting weaponized into a business dispute, a diss track, or a courtroom, and in one case, a gun. That's not really a coincidence. The music industry has never made it easy for artists to walk away clean, and hip-hop in particular has built entire empires on deals signed by teenagers who didn't fully understand what they were giving up. None of that excuses the artists who let it boil into public ugliness, but it does explain why it keeps happening. A generation after generation, label after label. And if you enjoyed this one, you'll definitely want to check out these videos on your screen next. Have a good one.